Jen's been with CIS for almost now longer than anyone else, except for Barry Maley, who sort of has retired 3,000 times ever since, and he still turns up. Jen started here as working with Barry actually back in 1998, and save for a stint at the Australian as schools editor in one form or another. She's been a research fellow at CIS. She's only part-time at the moment. Have young children growing up, means that she can't spend as much time here as she'd like. Also doing a PhD complicates it a little bit. So that's why we're delighted she's here today. Her main area of work has been on school education, which she's written about extensively for years. She's probably been one of the more prominent writers in the area. Another one is in here, so Kevin Donnelly, I saw him earlier, and so he has also written in the area. But she's not only school funding, she talked about boys' education. This book here was well received when it first came out, and other stuff around those sorts of areas on employment, class sizes, school performance reporting, and so on. She's the author of this one, as I said, another Families, Freedom and Education, Schools in the Spotlight, and Schools of Thought, which was a collection of articles she wrote mostly when she was working at the Australian. Her other publications have been on childcare, female labour force participation, and also on New South Wales trains. For a number of years, when CIS was putting out a publication called The State of the Nation, she edited several of those. So I think many of you will know her work. She's been at the forefront of the debate on education, school education that is, and it's my pleasure to ask her to speak to us. Jen.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all of you for coming out tonight. And welcome back to some of you who were here the last time I spoke on this subject. I hope you'll find something new in what I'm talking about this evening. So I'll just get my little pointer. This evening I'm going to just make some comments about the Gonski report and what I see as being the effect of the Gonski report into the future. I'm not going to pull it apart word by word because I'm sure that many of you have your own thoughts on it, so I'm hoping to leave plenty of time at the end for some audience participation so that we can get some of your views as well. But I'll just start off by just giving my thoughts. The funding model, much to my surprise, seems to be fairly close to the model that I proposed in my submission, as well as a model that Jack Keating proposed in his submission and the Association of Independent Schools of Victoria. It's a bit of a hybrid, plus a few extra bits thrown in as well. Essentially, the components of the model that resemble mine and Jack's and the AISV are that it's student-centred, that it's an integrated model, so it covers all school sectors, that the funding for each student is variable according to their individual needs, and that it would be administered by an independent arbiter. So here I'm just going to show some of the similarities between the proposed models by way of describing the model in a bit more detail and talking then about some of the differences between the proposed models and what was actually recommended. The first one there is that it's universal and integrated, and that is a really important feature, that it's a funding model that is applied across all schools, that it's almost sector blind, not quite, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. It requires Commonwealth state cooperation and collaboration in funding, that it is student-centred, so it's allocated on a per capita basis based on what is considered to be a sufficient amount of money, at least at the base funding level, to educate a child to a reasonable standard. It is based on a resource standard for core funding, and that resource standard is based on a model that was initially devised in around about 2005 by Makeecha, and that was also covered in the Allen Consulting Group report, which was commissioned by the Review Committee last year. Some of the other features are that it has loadings for disadvantage. So for specific aspects of a student's need that may suggest that they would require extra levels of funding, and that those loadings would be cumulative. So a child with multiple special needs and multiple sources of disadvantage would have higher levels of funding than one with less. Each offers a minimum funding commitment to every child in every school, irrespective of the income of the school and the so-called capacity of parents to pay. And in some cases, public funding connected to the school's private fee revenue. That was something that I talked about as a way of replacing the SES model for various reasons, but in the end the Gonski model picked up the idea of capacity to pay, at least initially based on the SES funding model, but proposed that a new model be devised eventually. And part of my model and also of Keating's model was the possibility of 100% public funding to non-government schools that were public in most senses of the word at least, except for the fact that they might be not run by a state government. So if they had open enrolment, for example, if they didn't charge fees, then they ought to be entitled to be fully publicly funded. In the end, the Gonski model didn't adopt that particular aspect. It only offers a maximum of 90% funding. We proposed that the funding be fully portable for children with disabilities. At the moment, there is a big discrepancy between the level of funding for children with disabilities in the different school sectors, and most people would agree that that's a terrible situation for families who are dealing with that problem. And there was also the issue of providing incentives, financial incentives particularly, for non-government schools which were so-called more inclusive. And then there's also the issue of system funding, whether or not funding should be given directly to schools themselves, or whether they should be, in some cases, bulk funded as a system, and the system authority then allocates the funding to the school. So I'll talk a little bit about the dreaded voucher word. A lot of people are critical of the idea of a voucher system, and I think a lot of people who have embraced this idea and this model put forward in the Gonski report have in the past been very critical of the idea of a voucher system, but in essence they're very similar. So the similarities are that a voucher system and the Gonski model are both student-centred. They both apply universally across schools. They're needs-based. They allow parents to choose among schools and take their funding with them. And it allows a diversity of schools to be a part of the education sector and potentially a diversity of providers. In contrast, these are the differences, which are a few. It's not entirely sector neutral, so there is some disadvantage financially for attending a non-government school. You can't receive the full amount in a non-government school of public funding as you would receive in a government school. And it allows for system funding, where a voucher model doesn't. So I'll start with the good points of the Gonski report. I think it's a pretty good and fair overview and summary of the school system, school funding, and performance results. It doesn't go into a huge amount of detail, but I think it's sufficient. It also recognises the importance of private investment in schools in all sectors, and it provides a balanced overview of the sources of funding into schools instead of just trumpeting the old figures about Australia versus the OECD in public funding. It includes the private funding as well and shows how important that is to resourcing schools in Australia. And it raises the issue of philanthropy, which is again a really important one, particularly for government schools, because they have been underserved by that particular source of funding. Well, basically, the funding model, I don't think, is anyone's idea of perfection. It represents a compromise in a lot of ways from what various people have proposed. But to my mind, it's good enough, and it's certainly an improvement on what the arrangements are at the moment. I'm not sure that you'd ever reach an ideal. It's a triumph of the good over the perfect, I think. And surprisingly also, it's been really well received across the board and in various different sectors, by parent groups, by the different education authorities in the different sectors, principals, associations. It's been surprising the level of bonhomie that's been around since the report was released. Another good point of the Gonski report is that it proposes simplifying funding. Instead of having lots of different specific disparate programs that are being funded by government, that it all gets rolled into one resource and revenue stream for schools, and then they, by and large, hopefully decide what to do with it, rather than having a line-by-line accounting approach. To a large extent, Commonwealth funding has already, this has already happened with Commonwealth funding. There aren't anywhere near as many different programs funded by the Commonwealth as there used to be. There used to be a couple of dozen lines in the budget, and now it's down to about half a dozen. Importantly, the Gonski report, perhaps somewhat reluctantly, but it does, acknowledges that choice is an important feature of the school sector in Australia. And it does acknowledge that school choice has benefits across the board, that it doesn't have to be seen as being at the other end of the spectrum from equity, which is the way some of the other commentary has portrayed choice. They exist together. And again, fully portable funding for students with disabilities, a really important feature, and I think there's universal agreement about that. These are some of the concerns that I have about the Gonski report. Number one would be the $5 billion price tag, which seems to have been, to me, a case of buying reform without having really a great deal of evidence to back it up. I'm not sure where the $5 billion exactly came from. It seems to be, to me, a bit of a back of an envelope calculation. And of course, you know, being in the economic conditions that we are in at the moment, it was never going to be wholeheartedly accepted, a $5 billion price tag. And I would really hate to see the whole process fall over because it's seen as this is the price that has to be paid for reform, and I don't think that it is. I think also within this report there seems to be a sense that this amount of money is chump change, and that governments have endless amounts of money to spend without any particular evidence for its benefits in the long run. I think one of the quotes in the paper, it says, based on its current proportion of total funding, the Australian government would bear around 30% of the increase, meaning about 30% of that $5 billion. But in fact, it's the Australian people who bear 100% of the increase. Governments don't actually have any money. And I'm not saying that $5 billion isn't necessary. I'm just saying at this point there isn't really any evidence to say that it is. My last comment there is about the nature of taxation. I won't get into that too much, but there's a sense in the report that you can sort of divide the burden of the cost increase by dividing it between levels of government. Essentially, it all comes from the same place, and trying to divide it up just creates convoluted negotiations with COAG and so on, which I think are unnecessary. It doesn't deal with the problem of funding maintained and funding guaranteed schools, and that was the major source of criticism of the SES funding model for non-government schools. It doesn't really explain how, given the promise that no school will lose a dollar, how you transition schools from one level of funding to another. And if they're not to lose a dollar, you need to maintain some kind of funding guarantee or funding maintenance. Those two things don't really sit together, and if they do, then that's certainly not explained in the report. There is a heavy focus on equity and disadvantage, which is right. However, there's very little attention paid to the idea of excellence. In a 226-page document, there's a whole chapter, 40 pages, devoted to creating equity. The word excellence is, it appears 7 times in the whole document. It doesn't really deal with that question at all. And we do know, well and truly by now, that that's a problem with our schools, is that we're not achieving excellence with our best students. Another thing that bothers me a little is this idea of system funding. I do wonder if, even if we create a new way of working out what level of funding ought to be allocated to each student, if that is then all bundled up and given to the states to allocate as they see fit under their own funding decision-making process, I wonder if that does actually then create any more transparency at all. I don't have a problem with system funding per se. In the non-government system sector, the system participation is generally voluntary, and so they work out the cost-benefit for themselves. However, in state schools, they don't have that opportunity. They have to just be part of the group and get what they're given. The Gonski report assumes a very large role for government in schools without really providing any justification. It's just taken as a given. And as such, it adds new levels of regulation and accountability, particularly aimed at non-government schools. And it's to do with financial accounting and so on, mostly, which I don't see any benefit in. And another big concern that I have is that it doesn't really think about schools at the margins of the model that it proposed. So it doesn't allow for 100% publicly funded non-government schools, such as free schools in the UK or charter schools in the US. So there's no opportunity, well, not no opportunity, but very few opportunities for a non-government school to be a free school, essentially. That can only happen if it's a sole provider school, so if it's in a remote area of Australia where there are no other schools, or if it's a special needs school. At the other end of the spectrum, it also doesn't discuss or make any provision for fully independent schools, schools that choose to eschew government funding so that they can be free to a larger extent of state intervention. And while I'm not sure that there would be a large number of schools that would fall into that category, I think it's important for them to be able to exist, and that's not acknowledged. So I'll finish up by saying that although there's been a fair bit of talk in the lead up to the Gonski report about funding not being the main game and it not being important, we need to think about other things rather than funding. I would argue that it is. Funding and governance, which are two sides of the same coin, they provide the foundations and the parameters for all the other things that schools do. What happens in the classroom is certainly the most important thing, and choice and school autonomy are important, but they're highly dependent on the way that schools are regulated and resourced. So I think it's really important now to resolve the funding question so that we can move on to other things. Secondly, there has been a fair bit of talk about the fact that this was an 18-month review and now they're looking for further consultation. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but I do think that there has to be some more detail before any more consultancy has any meaning at all. We need some more detail about the modelling of the school resource standard. That needs to be done straight away, and it needs to be released as soon as possible so that we can actually discuss it. Otherwise, we talk about it for another couple of months, more information comes out, and we talk about it again for another couple of months, and the whole process is protracted. Some sectors I know have some concerns about the way the school resource standard is to be calculated. Firstly, about the reference schools that will be used to devise the school resource standard, and secondly, about the use of NAPLAN data. But the next round of consultation, I think, will have to be done with those details, because the whole thing stands or falls, essentially, on the school resource standard and whether or not there's agreement that that is a sufficient standard for the funding model to be based on. I think it would be hugely disappointing if the opportunity to reform school funding now is wasted. It's a good time to do it. We've had the conversation, everyone seems to be talking instead of warring. And I think there's a danger of the reform not taking place if the $5 billion is seen as the most important part of the process. The economic conditions might not be ideal at the moment, and it looked for a while as though the political conditions might not be either. But at the moment we seem to have a Prime Minister who is intellectually engaged with education and is really interested and involved, and I think it's a good opportunity to undertake reforms now.